Good evening. Tonight we are continuing our discussion of the Gospel of Thomas, and we are continuing it with verse 14. Good evening, Bishop Peterson.
Good evening, Bishop Canterbury.
How are you?
I'm wonderful.
Well, why don't we dive right into this? And as usual, I'm going to ask you to read the verse for our viewers.
Gospel of Thomas, verse 14. Jesus said to them, "If you fast, you will bring sin upon yourselves, and if you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give to charity, you will harm your spirits. When you go into any region and walk about in the countryside, when people take you in, eat what they serve you and heal the sick among them. After all, what goes into your mouth will not defile you. Rather, it's what comes out of your mouth that will defile you."
Great verse.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, one of my favorites, even though I am sure a lot of our viewers hear me say that about a lot of Gospel of Thomas, because Gospel of Thomas may be my favorite of all Gnostic Gospels, only because of the sayings in there I think are so beautiful. But this one I think strikes lots of points. You know, anything comes to mind right off the bat? I mean, your first feelings, impressions when you hear this verse, Bishop Peterson?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of parallels to it in the canonical scriptures. There's in Matthew 15, and there are some other references in the canonical Gospels to this. You know, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. That's Matthew 15:11. Now, and I think it's in the Gospel of Mark that saying is a little bit different. It is what goes into your mouth does not defile, but what comes out of your body is what defiles you. Some people have associated that passage with simply saying, you know, if you eat something it's taboo, it's excrement, and that's it, and you're done with it. But this Gospel of Thomas and Matthew seem to be saying something a little bit different. It's what's coming out of your mouth that's going to defile you. And I tie this back a little bit to my favorite book in the canonical scriptures, the book of James. In which he talks about how the tongue is what gets us into all kinds of trouble, with things that we say, and we end up committing ourselves to certain acts. We end up getting ourselves into conflicts. We harm other people with our tongue. So I kind of like this this passage because it says to me, you know, this idea that we can pay attention all we like to what we're eating and to fasting and to avoiding certain foods, but that is not, that's temporary. It's what we say to others, what we teach, that in the end can bring disgrace upon us far more than anything that we eat. So I thought that was what was also significant. Now, the other thing is that there is a parallel as well to the Gospel of Thomas, Logion 6, in which he says, his disciples questioned him and said to him, "Do you want us to fast? And how shall we pray? Shall we give alms? And what kind of diet shall we follow?" Jesus says, "Do not lie, and do not do what you hate. For all things are disclosed before heaven. For there is nothing obscure that will not be shown forth, and there is nothing covered that will remain without being disclosed." So I think it's interesting that, you know, when they're asking him for specific instructions on how to conduct themselves, he kind of just sidesteps that and says, you know, behave yourself. And that he doesn't associate it with certain religious acts. And in here, in 14, he's saying, it's speaking of possible consequences of these spiritual disciplines. Fasting, you bring sin upon yourselves. And if you pray, you'll be condemned. And if you give to charity, you will harm your spirits. So I find the various parallels, both within the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical Gospels, to be very interesting.
Interesting. You know, for me, I think what sticks out is kind of the middle of the passage, you know, because to me, we sort of have kind of three parts in this, which seems kind of common in a lot of these sayings. And the middle part of this passage reminds me a lot of the Famine of the Rosicrucians.
Okay.
You know, we basically get an agreement with the Brothers of the Rose Cross, and the first is that none of them should profess any other thing but to cure the sick.
Right.
and that gratis, that meaning for free.
Mm-hmm.
And that none of them should be constrained to wear a certain kind of habit, but to follow the custom of the country.
Mm-hmm.
We could go on into the rest of that, but that's not what our discussion is. But I see, again, some parallels of the Fama from this Gospel of Thomas right here. When I look at this verse, I guess what I'm bringing out of this, if you fast, you will bring sin upon yourself. Okay, let's just take that simply at first. For me, this implies that, if you're doing these things that you hate, if you're doing these things purely because you were told to do these things, you're going to be bringing sin upon yourself. I don't think this particular verse is telling you that if one is drawn by one spirit into fasting, or if one is drawn by one spirit into prayer, that these things are bad. It's not that if you pray you're going to be condemned, or if you're fasting you're bringing sin. I think it is when one is doing these things without pure intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Instead of, okay, well, it is 6 o'clock in the morning and I have to get up and do my morning prayer. It is 8 o'clock and now I have to do this prayer. It is 12 o'clock, I have to do this prayer. And nothing against anyone who has particular schedules. Many of the traditions that I follow do have prayer schedules. But again, is it your intent, when you're doing these things, if one is fasting, is it for one's pure spirituality, or is it simply because we are, following a certain program or agenda that that really our heart is into? And so, that's kind of what I get from this whole entire beginning part. Again, walking, into this, second section in here, when you go into any region and walk about the countryside, when people take you and eat what they serve you, which I find very, 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 very interesting, because there are other sects, probably several months ago, we had a Gnostic bishop who was discussing the Cathar diet. And interesting that later on, other groups that we kind of identify with the Gnostic movement had very strict dietary codes. But here we're seeing out of the mouth of Christ, when you're in a region, eat what the people give you, basically taking away any of those dietary restrictions. Now, what are your thoughts, though, on that? I mean, do you think that there is more going on than what the words simply are on the page? Do you think there was something else that maybe was implied?
Well, I think that, there's may have been, there seems to be a kind of a mishmash of certain sayings into one verse here. They've been kind of compacted in here. What I think is interesting is he, in the middle part there, is he putting the priority on going out and healing? And saying that if you, and then perhaps preceding this with kind of a warning about holding to certain spiritual practices, with the possibility that those practices could be interfering with what their actual mission is. Mm-hmm. His disciples were being sent out and were being sent out to heal. Now, if they're being told that if they go in there and they refuse to eat what they're being offered by people, what kind of harm can that do to their relationships with the people that they're trying to work with? Or perhaps are they just going to starve because they're not going to have any access to food? And perhaps the same is true with the alms and the prayers, that if they're so concerned about a prayer rule and giving alms and maintaining dietary restrictions, is that going to interfere with the mission that he has set before them? And then, of course, he falls right into this, and he finishes it off by saying, first of all, what's going into your mouth isn't going to defile you. It's what comes out of your mouth that's going to defile you. And to me, there's a sense in which he is addressing a concern probably about diet firstly, but then, of course, the other areas of prayer and giving charitably. And so I think you hit on something, Bishop Canterbury, when you look at that middle of that passage there. That may be the focal point here, because he is addressing how his disciples need to be carrying out that mission. And even earlier they've even asked about it, and he continues to sidestep it because he wants to get to the heart of the matter, or to their own hearts, rather than focusing on specific behavior. Now, all this does not mean that I personally have a problem with spiritual discipline. We've talked many, many times on this show about the importance of spiritual discipline.
Absolutely.
But this, I think, we're looking at here, there was a specific mission, a specific vocation that was given to these disciples, and that was what they had to focus on at this time. Now, another thing that another commentator that I've read pointed out that at some point Jesus in the canonical Gospels, and I forget where this was, but spoke about how when the people don't fast when the bridegroom is with them, but when the bridegroom goes away, then they will fast. And one commentator pointed out that in the Gospel of Thomas, the kingdom is here and now. Jesus is with them right now. The bridegroom is there. So there is no reason for them to fast as well. So there could be that aspect. That would be one other way of looking at this passage as well.
Interesting.
But I do think that you're pointing to something very important. There's a mission here, and perhaps for those of us who are Gnostic clergy or agnostics or Christians of any stripe, when we have a vocation, when we have a mission, we can't be so sidetracked by a discipline of ours that may in fact interfere with our ability to meet that deeper obligation.
Interesting. Another point that I want to sort of bring out about this last verse here is that, after all, what goes into your mouth will not defile you, rather it's what comes out of your mouth. I think, again, this is something we can look at several ways. The mouth, if we look at various symbols of things that were esoteric during that time, we see many references, especially to a feast that just happened yesterday, the Feast of Mary Magdalene, but of Jesus kissing her upon the mouth. The mouth has always kind of been associated as sort of this symbol of initiation. And part of that, I think, stems from kind of this idea of the divine breath. The breath that has emanated upon the waters, the divine breath that carries the spirit. It is life. So, what goes into your mouth will not defile you, rather it's what comes out of your mouth. I think this can even kind of be kind of a key of regarding initiation. Is that it's not necessarily the particular spirit of this maybe current or initiation that is going to defile you or make you a profane or non-initiated, but it's rather what one has done with these particular teachings, and now that you're spewing out, that will really defile you. So if you're basically, taking the teachings maybe of the master who was talking to his disciples, and these things became twisted or perverted, those what would have defiled them rather than the teachings that were coming in. Again, these are just kind of things that I'm throwing out there for our listeners to kind of observe whenever they're reading any of these Gospels, of trying to look at the text not just from a literal base, but other ways that may give them a little bit deeper insight into a particular passage.
I think it was Yves Leloup, who's written commentaries on several of the Gnostic Gospels, who's pointed that out about initiation as well, that there may be some concern about initiation in that passage. You'll have to double check that later on. But certainly, if the idea is that as they're healing, if they are communicating the healing with word, with breath, and we see that in the Gospels. Jesus accompanies the healing with laying on of hands, but also with the command to be healed. That could certainly have some impact if an individual is not in a right state of right heart state. If they are not following through on their vocation, that can certainly defile the kind of ministry that they have to others. So I think that
I would have to agree with all of those. For our viewers, though, I think, we kind of probably need to ask them a question, is what does this mean to them? And we would definitely like to see the answer to that question in the comments of our YouTube, or even on our Facebook page. What does this particular verse 14 mean to you? What insights have you had regarding this particular verse?
And do you find it discouraging to have all of these wonderful spiritual disciplines, dissed by Jesus? We'd like to hear what you have to say about that, particularly after we've been spending all these shows trying to get people into spiritual disciplines and trying to do it ourselves, of course. So, yes, we do want to hear from you on that. We also want to remind everybody that after this show, we will be taping our After Dark podcast. Deacon John DeGilio, who has been a guest several times on our show, will be joining us, and it's always a really awesome time when he joins us. And if you are one of our patrons of our show, you can, of course, sit in on the taping of that show. The rest of you, the show will be placed online within a few days, so you can listen to it. But if you are one of our patrons, you're welcome to sit in on the show and ask, type in questions and throw peanuts in the peanut gallery if you wish at us. And if you are interested in learning how to be a patron of our show, please visit our Patreon page at Patreon, patreon.com/Gnostic. On that site, you can pledge a small amount per video or podcast that we put out, and you can pledge as little or as much as you like, and you can set a cap on it. So if you can only afford a few dollars each month, you can cap that, and you won't be getting any surprises on your credit card. And of course, all of your support directly supports the development of this and other programs that focus on educating people about the light of Gnosis. So we do appreciate those who do support the show, and we encourage you to check out our Patreon page. Before we close the show, Bishop Canterbury, I know you and I talked a little bit beforehand. There have been some really upsetting things going on in the world this past week. There has been some real tragedies in the Middle East, as well as with the airplane that was shot down over the Ukraine, and these are rough times. And we want to express our concern, certainly our condolences to those who have lost friends and family, and our concern for people in those regions right now.
The only thing that I want to offer to these people, without trying to take any sides politically, is simply that of peace. Yeah. And if we can just offer prayers of peace within the Ukraine, peace within the Middle East, and again, in some way offer prayers that the pain and suffering of all of those afflicted by injury and through these great tragedies, that their families can be lifted from this pain. Just terrible. It's been a terrible week on what's going in, and I do sincerely pray for peace in these regions, as well as the ending of pain and suffering for these people.
Absolutely. And yes, and I hope and encourage everybody who's watching to join us in these prayers. So again, we want to thank everybody for joining us this week. Next week, we're going to have a great show. Scott Jones, who has written a wonderful book called When the Stars Are Right, is going to be on the show talking about Lovecraftian spirituality. This book that he wrote, I read it a few months ago. It was the first time I've got excited about a book in a long time. And I've never actually read Lovecraft, but his book got me so excited that I just had to have him on the show. I'm going to talk about Black Gnosis, what he calls Black Gnosis, and this way of approaching spirituality that is incredibly imaginative and unique. And I'm really looking forward to having him on the show. So I'm hoping everybody who's watching us now will join us next week for that show.
Sounds like a great show.
Yeah. All right, and so again, we do appreciate your feedback. Please, you can find us online at our Facebook page. You can make comments on this video. You can also send us an email at talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. So take care, and thank you for joining us.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.